Throughout history, freethinkers have outraged the religious with their wacky ideas about the virtues of free speech, reason, and of course, eating babies. Now, God is dying, and it's time to dispose of his remains. From the pits of hell, Satan sends two puppets of the imperialist West and the Zionist Jews against God, Islam, and tiny kittens to bring you their propaganda and conspire for a new world order. This is Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment with Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi, and with me is Armin Navabi. Armin, good morning to you, right?
Yes.
It's evening for me and it's morning for Armin. Just a quick note for everybody that there is a website, secularjihadist.com, for those of us who are joining us for the first time or who are listening for the first time. You can go to the website. We are very thankful to all of our patrons who are helping support the show. You can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/SJME. If you can't, then just if you like the episodes, you don't have to support the show. You can share it. You can leave us a review on iTunes. You can do. There are many different ways of supporting it. Just a note, though, once we get to 500 patrons, we will start translating a lot of our shows into Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Malay, a lot of the languages Bengali that are spoken in some majority countries, Bengali and so on. So do consider becoming a patron. Anyway, I'm going to get to this today. Today we have on a guest. He's a professor and a writer who I've been quite influenced by a lot of his writings. He's written several books. He is a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. He specializes in the sociology of secularity. And he has written several books, including the one that I was introduced to him by was Living the Secular Life in 2014. He's also written his latest book, What It Means to Be Moral, Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life. And this is the topic that we're going to be discussing with him today. Professor Phil Zuckerman, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a fan of yours as well.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, like I did blurb your book, and I said it was brilliant and provocative. And it kind of, after I read it, one thing sort of hit me is that people say that people who are non-religious tend to somehow not be moral, and I've realized that most people who choose to be non-religious, for them, it's a moral choice. They actually do it because they can't reconcile their sense of morality that's based on, say, whatever the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, with what they learn about the religions that they've been raised in. So, I mean, that's something that really, really jumps out overall as a theme in your book. And I really, really liked it. So I enjoyed it. I think I read the whole thing in about 2 days.
Nice.
So when he sent it to me.
Appreciate that.
So just to start with, how did you become interested in this, in secularity, and later on in the idea of morality and secularism and non-belief? Where did it all begin?
Yeah, I'll try to give a cogent narrative there. Yeah. First of all, I just want to comment though on your initial observation. It just struck me that it is really a paradox in that religious people think that if you don't have religion, you can't be moral, or atheists are immoral, and yet many people who become atheists do so because of their moral compass. I don't know. I just thought there was some interesting balance there, or symmetry in a paradoxical way. In terms of how I got interested in secularity and then the morality, what I would say is that I was not raised in a religious home, at least in terms of belief. We talk as sociologists and trying to study religion, we talk about the 3 B's: belief, behavior, and belonging, as kind of trying to map the religious landscape, and these seem to be the big pillars. And even though I was from a ethnic Jewish community, all 4 of my grandparents were refugees. So in terms of the belonging, I understood religion.
Sorry,
that aspect.
sorry to cut you off. Your mic is touching your shirt. Do you think you could?
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, there you
It's hard, it's also hard for me to. I can't hear myself, so it's making me feel like I'm in underwater. Is there any way to fix that?
You could remove one of the headsets from one of
See if that works.
So much better.
Actually, can you do the other one, because you remove the one with the microphone? That would be better.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
That's great.
You're not using this microphone?
That one's not coming up. It's the one that's coming in from your earphones. It's fine though. If this works for you, this works for us too.
Yeah,
this works for me a lot better. That's a relief.
Okay, good.
So,
all right, continue.
We'll edit this part out.
You were saying from the 3 pillars: belief, community, and behavior. You understood the community one because of your Jewish background. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we talk about belief, behavior, and belonging, and so I grew up without the belief. In fact, I'm a 3rd-generation atheist. All 4 of my grandparents were non-believers. My parents were non-believers. So the belief part, I never quite could understand. And when I started to meet religious people, that kind of freaked me out. I was like, "What? You really believe this stuff?" You know, when I first, because I grew up in a pretty secular neighborhood, people were just, religion was not that big of a deal. But so I really wanted to study religion to try to make sense of it. To try to understand it. And there's a huge, vast ocean of scholarship if you want to study religion. So you can study the history of religion, the philosophy of religion, the psychology of religion, the anthropology of religion, the sociology of religion, the literature of religion. I mean, there's so much, and that's a good thing. We need to study religion. But it occurred to me about 10 or 15 years ago that there was no scholarship devoted to the study of secular life, secular people, secular culture, secular movements, the history of secularity, secular ideologies and political movements. And obviously in philosophy, there was always debates about the existence of God going back to ancient days. But in terms of the social sciences, anthropology, psychology, sociology, economics, political science, I felt like, or many of us felt like, the secular was being ignored. And that's not good, because the social science is about studying humanity, and we want to understand the human experience, and we want to study people. And there's a huge growing chunk of people that are not religious. They don't believe in supernatural things. They don't identify with religions. They don't congregate with fellow religious brothers and sisters. And they're a huge chunk of humanity. In many countries, they're the majority. And so I got interested in the study of all aspects of secularity, right? How do secular people live? How do they raise their children? That kind of thing. But I'm interested in all aspects. So that's what I started studying. That's what I did my research on, studying secular culture, studying secular people. But the question that came up most often at dinner or, at parties was the morality question. So, that's what people seem to really grasp. It's almost as if it's the last thing they've got. Like, science has kind of won the debate about like how the physical universe works. Like, no, you're not going to get anybody saying like, yeah, but what holds up the clouds, or what created the stars? Everybody kind of accepts now that science explains much of how the natural world works. But the morality one is, well, they say, well, but how can you be moral if you don't believe in God? Or how can you be moral? How can there be morality if there is no God? And as a sociologist, I really didn't have a lot of training in that. It sort of seemed obvious to me, well, you can look at societies that are highly secularized. They're not descending into moral chaos. In fact, the most secular societies on the earth today are among the most moral and ethical. They have the lowest murder rates, the lowest. So I would do that.
And you've written a whole book on that, I think, on Scandinavian society without God. I think
exactly.
On the Scandinavian societies. Yeah.
I have.
There's Susan Jacoby wrote the New York Times review for Living a Secular Life, and she started it with an anecdote where I think, if I'm remembering correctly, if I'm not, forgive me, but I think she was at a party or some kind of gathering, and someone said that, well, if you're an atheist, if you don't believe in God, then what stops you from going around and murdering people?
Exactly.
And that is, I think that's a crux. That's the most common thing that people have.
I get that. I've heard comments like that all the time. I remember doing a debate at a church, and a guy said to me in the lobby afterwards, he said, the only reason I don't go around raping women is because of God. And I'm like,
what does that say about you as a person?
Exactly. And I left that debate thinking, oh, it's projection. The idea that you see in others what's actually going on in your own subconscious. So I started to think the reason people think atheists are immoral is this projection. Like, are you kidding me? Like, empathy, compassion, you don't want to cause somebody else pain and suffering. This doesn't factor. It's just that, this being is watching you and might punish you. So.
I don't think it's projection, because I think a lot of these people that claim that religion and God is stopping them from doing evil things, if you take away God and religion from them, they're not going to go around raping and killing people, even those people that think they need God. But why do you think it is that even atheists and secularists sometimes think maybe some people need religion to be moral? To me, that because it does suggest that religion has been very, very successful at spreading the idea or that they own morality, or that they have a monopoly over morality. And I think it's mostly Abrahamic religions that do that, because historically this was not something that people thought. Like, before Abrahamic religions, gods were not in charge of giving us moral codes that much. I mean, Hammurabi, we have some examples, but gods were assholes themselves, and they raped and killed, and people are like, yeah, these gods are assholes, we just need to keep them happy. It was the Abrahamic religions that really gave us the idea of that, oh, gods want you to behave a certain way. But they have been so effectively selling that idea that now even most of the planet thinks like, how could we have morality without God? But
I think you've just given the narrative right there. I mean, that's absolutely right. Basically, human morality precedes the world religions, for sure. But at a certain point, these societies told stories, and stories are powerful, and those stories got written down, and those stories became hegemonic, and they became adopted by powers in the world, the Roman Empire and Europe. And the Arab powers took these stories, and those narratives from the Quran and the Old Testament and the New Testament became the dominant stories for 2,000 years. And I think it's just because of that ability they had the monopoly on the printing presses, they had the monopoly on government, so they had the monopoly on whatever media was available, and we're seeing that start to chip away now finally. But I think you're right, for many centuries, religion basically said, we're the source of morality, everybody against us is immoral, and they've been able to just get that story into our DNA, the DNA of our societies, sure.
But given that, like, before Abrahamic religions, like, we had Greek philosophers and Far East philosophers trying to logically come up with ethical, and moral standards, it seemed like it's not within our nature for us to be confused by this, because before the Abrahamic religions, people weren't looking at gods to come up with moral codes. We had many philosophers throughout history before religion trying to come up with a lot of nuanced discussions, some of them with good conclusions, some of them with bad conclusions, but they didn't think like they did in the divine authority to come up with these standards, and people didn't question it back then as well. Like, so this whole confusion that people are like, oh, what do we do with that religion? It does seem like it's a new thing, like new. I understand 2,000 or 4,000 years doesn't seem new, but given that civilization is like 10,000 years old, it is new. And it also doesn't seem like, for people to suggest this is a natural confusion, it might not be that natural, because this was not a confusion before, right?
Hard for me to speak to that. I'm just not a historian. I just don't have the knowledge of how people argued or thought about morality 5,000, 10,000 years ago. Just hard for me to say.
So I had a question about, is there a difference between and we'll get to some of the more basic stuff later, but I just really wanted to ask you this. Is there a difference between because we talk about an empathy of morality that's rooted in empathy, but in a sense that this idea of if someone steals from me, then I steal from them, right? That is also sort of in a way, when it came to justice codes, that was also the law for a while, which could be seen as rooted in empathy as well. That, okay, that's just like the idea of a revenge-based kind of morality. Now, using that, and that's the kind of thing that people sometimes feel like someone comes and kills, your child or does something terrible to your child. You say, well, I want to go. It's a good thing we have a justice system. Otherwise, I would just go and I'd just kill this person, or I'd do something horrible to them. And is there a difference between wanting to see justice done to somebody by punishing them, versus having a more sort of objective rationality-based justice, more than empathy-based? I don't know if I'm being clear in what I'm saying. Does that make sense? Or
I think so. I mean, yeah, these are very different things. I think there are gut desires and gut feelings for some kind of revenge when we've been wronged, when we've been harmed. There's a desire to see the perpetrator harmed to the same degree. But that
as a form of justice,
as a form of justice,
moral justice, yeah,
you bet. But what I believe is that the story of moral progress is realizing that you can't base a society on that type of tit for tat. That if you look at criminal codes, they went from, if someone cuts your ear off, then they get their ear cut off. Or it's even worse. If you look at Hammurabi's code, it was like, if someone harms your kid, then you get to harm their kid, as if the kid now has to have their leg chopped off.
Oh, they still do that in Pakistan, in some villages. There's actual feudal courts that say that allow for example, the rape of somebody's sister, if of a rapist sister, if he's So that's what happened to Mukhtar Mai as well. Yeah.
It's horrific, and I think that as we progress, we realize that when you have that kind of a justice system, it actually, in the end, makes things worse for everybody. So the idea is public safety, not necessarily revenge. So we do what we can do to, if we can compensate the victim, we do our best. But there are some horrific crimes that there's no compensation that could ever make up for what happened. I mean, I've had friends who were murdered. I don't know how murdering the murderer doesn't bring my friend back. So justice has to be without passion. It has a justice system, an institutional system, has to be dispassionate and rational. And that desire for revenge is neither of those things. And but I think the desire for justice is a real desire. It's part of our human nature. And so I do think that governments have to balance sort of humane policy with the desire for justice, and how you do that is going to be different in different cultures and different societies.
So can we, can we ask the main question? Like, I think a lot of people that might be religious that would be listening to this podcast, the main question that they're going to have, like, okay, fine, you're saying there's going to be morality without God and all that. What is the source of morality if you don't have God? Like, so can we? That's the main question people are going to have.
Yeah. So where does morality come from if it doesn't?
Yeah. So morality comes from us. It comes from human beings, human culture. It comes from the kind of brains we have. It comes from our experiences and our ability to recognize suffering. And that's it. The idea, I mean, you have to understand, when we talk about something being moral, that's an adjective. If we call a person moral or we call an action moral, it's a describer. It's like calling something beautiful. And so that's like someone saying, well, where does beauty come from? Well, beauty is something that we recognize as humans, but it changes and shifts over time. There's no absolute, it's not like something, tells us what is beautiful in, oh, that's what beauty is. It's like, it's something we feel, it's something we recognize, but it changes and shifts. So if you think about, when we talk about morality, what are we talking about? We have to define it. What do you mean by morality? Oh, first we got to define it. And there's no ultimate definition other than what we can agree on through conversation and discussion. It's not written under some rock somewhere that, look, here's the definition of morality. I discovered this, it's from 7,000 years ago. And even if it was, what does that mean? Oh, someone wrote something under a rock 7,000 years ago. So morality, as I understand it, means things like not harming people, helping people in need, not causing unwanted suffering, alleviating unwanted suffering if possible, seeking justice and fairness, being kind, being loving, being altruistic, being honest. So we could talk about different virtues. We could talk about different types of intentions or actions or consequences that on some level mean morality. So morality would be alleviating unwanted suffering and so on and so forth. So now the question is, well, where does that come from? What is the source of that? And I would say the sources are as follows. Number one, it comes from our evolutionary history. For hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, we lived, us and our earliest primate relatives, in small groups of between 20 and 80 people, and cooperation helped group survival. And all that means is that those groups that could cooperate, their offspring had an increased chance of reproducing. It doesn't mean that we chose to be. So groups that were kind to each other, took care of each other, took care of the sick, took care of the infirm, who were honest, who could feel what each other was feeling, those groups did better, and their offspring survived to this day. The groups that were characterized by selfishness, greed, animosity, distrust tended to die out. We still have that in our nature, but it's not the dominant force. That's number one. Number two, in that evolutionary story, we developed brains with a heightened capacity for empathy and compassion. We have peptides and pathways neurologically that allow us to feel what someone else is feeling, to understand what someone is going through. So we're very sensitive to suffering. And that is the empathy and compassion are the ultimate drivers that cause me not to want to witness your suffering, that make me feel sick and bad if I watch or see someone else in pain, in agony, emotional or physical or both. So our evolutionary history as cooperating group animals, the kind of brains we have, which developed the ability to be empathetic and compassionate. On top of that, you throw culture, right? We are all raised by other humans. We can't exist without other humans raising us. So in that raising, we learn what the norms and values of our culture and society are. And finally, we have our own minds that can reflect and think about and rationally consider actions and consequences. We have a word. It's called ought, O-U-G-H-T. That word is maybe what defines human beings. We can think, what ought we do, right? I don't think my dog does that to the same degree, or a goldfish. I mean, maybe other primates might think, what ought I do to get those ants out of that tree? But we reflect on our actions and the consequences of our actions to an extreme degree. So all of those things is where we get our morality. But I'll end with this. That is actually one of the advantages that religion has. It tells people that they get their morality in this very facile, simplistic way. Oh, I get my morality from a magical, invisible being, or I get my morality from the Quran or from the Bible. And it's easy to grasp onto. It makes sense. Whereas the sources of secular morality are more complex. I can't say, oh, I get morality from this book, or I get it from this scroll. It's like you have to unpack the evolutionary history of our society, the neurological components of the brain, socialization and enculturation, and reflection, and all these things working simultaneously.
Yeah, it's a harder story to tell.
Much harder,
right? So and it's not as simple, and that goes for a lot of. I mean, because even as soon as you start talking about the evolutionary hardwiring of it, it becomes difficult. And there seems to be evidence for this. I mean, I don't know if you read about that neurologist who was studying psychopathy, and then he was looking at all of these MRI scans. Or fMRI, I think, studies that he did on all of his subjects, and he had a control group, and there was this in the control group. There, one sort of psychopath kept popping up, and then he, redid the whole thing, blinded it again, and it kept on happening. And it turned out that specimen was actually himself, and he found out that he was a psycho. It's actually a really amazing story. There's you can Google it. There's articles about it. I remembered kind of vaguely, but there appears to be neurological evidence of people who lack empathy and show psychopathic behavior. That's how it's connected. So
absolutely. Yeah,
so it is actually quite literally hardwired into us.
Absolutely, and there's many cases where people who experience different degrees of brain damage, and suddenly their empathy evaporates or disappears. Yeah. There's no question that it's part of our neurological makeup.
Mm-hmm. Armin.
So it does seem to me that if we want to categorize the discussions that are being had in the secular community around this topic, there's people that are being obsessed with defining morality, and then the second category of discussions is like, okay, what this morality is, what is the source, and where are we getting it from? And when it comes to defining morality, I think a lot of us agree that this is something there is no definition of morality that is written in the fabric of the universe. This is something that we just have to come up with an agreement on and based on how useful a definition it is. And I think a lot of us agree on the fact that if the definition is based on avoiding suffering, then that's the best definition because it's going to lead to less suffering if that's the definition that we come up with, right? So if our goal is to reduce suffering, definitions around avoiding suffering are the best definitions. When it comes to where we get this morality from, it seems that part is also the answers to that is two categories of answers that two different camps that we get the answer from the secular community is the ones that focus on the natural aspect of that, like evolution and like that's mostly emphasizing the desire that we have for cooperation, for sympathy, and then the evolutionary reason for why we have that desire for us to be kind to each other. But then the second group of answers are focusing on the social agreements that we have came up with, the social standards, the rules. It's less about desires, but more about the standards and agreements that we made up to run better societies, right? And to me, it seems like a lot of people give these two answers as if they're separate answers, but I think the relationship between these two answers are very interesting to me because one of them fuels the other one. They're not the same thing, but the fact that we have a desire for less suffering, then it leads to, so that part is natural. That part we didn't create. The part that we create is systems and standards that is better than our nature. And the relation,
I agree.
Right, because our sympathy and our desires are very biased. Like we have a lot of examples. Like you care more about one little child in front of you that is hungry than a million children in Africa, right? So we have that natural desire.
Or you empathize with people who are your same race or the same tribe. Right.
Absolutely.
More than you would with the outgroups, yeah.
Absolutely.
So the standards that we come up with is better than even what nature has gifted. It's not it's not that the nature part is not important because we wouldn't even come up with those standards if we didn't have the nature to fuel those desires, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the relationship between science and our personal logic, right? Because we do want scientific standards because we understand the importance of logic, but the personal logic that nature has gifted us is very biased. So science gave us certain standards that adjust for those biases. And but morality, the sympathy is what we've been gifted to us by our nature, but the social standards that we come up with is much better than that sense of sympathy, right?
I agree.
Okay. So
yeah.
I wanted to ask, actually, there's one part in your book that I really liked is, I guess, people were talking about one of the common things you hear from people when they say that, you have lack of religion that creates immorality. And they give the example of Hitler and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and all of that. And Hitler was Catholic. He was an atheist, but anyway, that's a separate topic. But the larger point stands. They say all these mass killers of the 20th century killed millions and millions and millions of people. They all happened to be atheists, right? And they had an atheist philosophy. And you responded to it by kind of putting them in competition with God. So you said, okay, so let's take the death count of Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, so on. But then you have deaths caused by respiratory infection, 485 million, and this is between 1900 and 2000. By smallpox, 400 million, diarrhea, 226 million, malaria, 194 million, by snakes, 6 million, and you kept going. Yeah. And this is something that I find really interesting, and I'm curious to see, why you think this is that when people say that if there's a natural disaster, and their family gets saved, or the tornado. There was that famous incident when Wolf Blitzer, I think, went. I can't remember where it was. There was a tornado or a hurricane that hit. Yeah, I think it was Oklahoma, and it was Rebecca Vitzman, I think, and he asked her. He said, "Do you thank the Lord? Do you thank the Lord that your family got saved?" And she said, "No, actually, I'm an atheist."
Yeah.
And he should have followed up with, well, why is the atheist a person who survived, and what happened to all the believing Christians whose houses got swept away? But why do people think that? Why do people think that, okay, the hurricane, God saved us from the hurricane, but they never think of what actually put the hurricane in motion in the first place, if they're believers? Or would God save my kid cancer? My kid's cancer was cured. Well, wouldn't God have given the kid the cancer in the first place? Where is that? Why is that disconnect so common when it feels so obvious?
Yeah. Well, that's when I wish I had a psychology degree instead of a sociology degree. Clearly something to do with how our minds work. And clearly most people on planet Earth, they're not thinking deep enough about something, or the comfort is more important than the logic. A plane can crash, 300 bodies are strewn everywhere, there's one survivor, and they're like, God. It's like, wait, there's dead bodies everywhere. I have an aunt right now, a strongly Catholic aunt. There were fires in Los Angeles. She had to evacuate. 5 of her neighbors' houses burned down. Hers did not. And so she's like, see, it's God. He protected me. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, 5 of your neighbors' houses just burned down. So, and in that anecdote about God, basically that was a rabbi wrote to me and said, like, look at the 20th century, look at all the horror humans have wrought and all the genocides. Clearly we need God because we just do such a terrible job taking care of each other. And that's when I was like, well, really? We need God? God has allowed way more suffering and murder than all the humans. I mean, it's a little bit of a snarky point, but I just don't know why people don't take. I'll give you another example. Why, when religious people get news that they have a deadly disease, a terminal disease, why aren't they so happy? Like when the doctor comes in and says, you've got, lung cancer, you've got 3 months to live, why aren't they like, yes, I get to go see Jesus so soon. You guys have to wait here, but I'm going. It would be like,
well, they all know. I mean, they know deep inside, I guess.
And there's actually, talk about research, there are studies that show what kinds of people who wants extreme attempts to save life at the end of life when someone is having some kind of, they're dying. Do they want extreme measures taken to try and save them or not? And what they find in these, I think 2 studies I've seen like this, that actually the religious people want the extreme measures more than the secular people, who are a bit more accepting of their mortality, whereas the strongly religious people, who you would think would be like, no, don't go to extreme measures. Let me just go to the Lord. So I think at the end of the day, the reason people, they don't think, well, wait a minute. I mean, I remember being in church when I was a teenager. I had a girlfriend, and she took me to her father was a pastor, took me to the church, and they were all the people were praying for this couple that had a baby that was dying of a bad heart. And they were all praying. And I remember thinking, well, wait a minute, isn't God in charge of everything? Didn't God make that baby's heart defective? Like, why are we all praying for God to undo his own plan? Like, didn't God already? And then
there's a lot of insurance policies. They still say that natural disasters are acts of God. I mean, that's what they call it.
So weird. And then if
strange.
If they say, well, it's the devil, I'm like, wait, so the devil has power to thwart God's will? So I think at the end of the day, it's something about the human brain that most people need the comfort of thinking that there's a loving parent who kind of looks out for them if they behave well, and that kind of. I think Freud got it right in Future of Illusion. I think it's an infantile model that gets imprinted, right? We're bigger, powerful beings, take care of us and protect us and love us and feed us as long as we behave well. And then as people become adults, it's hard for them to shake that model. And why some people like us can think how irrational and illogical this is, but most people can't. What is it about our brains that is different from other brains? I would love to understand that.
So
me too.
I can do it a bit devil's advocate for the religious people in regards to that scenario of like praying for something that God did himself. They would say, well, that me praying for God to do something was also part of his plan. And Yeah, so like, but and then they would say, well, why does God need me to pray to him for him to change something? They would say, well, no, God didn't need anything. That was for your sake. That, you know, that suffering for you, it might seem like a big deal, but it's not. Given that this life is very small compared to your next life, which is the eternal life, these are going to seem like little bit of tragedies that seem like a big deal to you are going to seem like little bit of inconveniences for a much greater thing that God has planned for you. So that's what they would say. Right.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean that explains the tragedy, but it doesn't explain the logic behind praying for an outcome. In other words, if you're praying to God, please cure my daughter. I mean, to me, Ali, I think the most moving passages I've read, many people have talked about, how can God allow a certain amount of suffering and the problem of evil. But when you write about, I think it was your nieces or nephews that died.
Oh, my cousin who had leukemia.
I just was crying. I just wept through that. I've never heard it written about so eloquently. And so to me, the idea of petitionary prayer, where you're asking God for something, is just fundamentally illogical because, in other words, also getting back to the morality. I mean, let's say I take my son skateboarding this weekend, and we're at a skate park, and I'm sitting there watching him, and he falls and he hits his head, and he's bleeding, and I just sit there, and he's unconscious, and I just sit there, and then a parent comes up to me and it was like, "Is that your kid?" And I say, "Yeah," and they say, "Well, why don't you help him?" And I say, "Well, he didn't ask." I mean, that would be ridiculous. Like, what do you mean? And they say, "Well, call 911." I said, "Why? He didn't ask." It's like God is watching everything. So if you're going to so God has to be asked to help ease your suffering. Like your child is sick, so you have to, God, please cure doesn't God know? So the idea that you have to ask an all-powerful being to do something that he already knows is just, man, that would make God an immoral monster, right?
Right. So the explanation for that, again, I'm just playing devil's advocate. The explanation for that. So the thing is that but the explanation to that is, like, as humans, we think that we know what we need, but God knows what we need more. And when we're suffering, that suffering might actually be a blessing, because when we're praying to God, it's not the removing the illness that really is benefiting us. The act of prayer is bringing us closer to God. And getting closer to God is even more important than that illness going away. We don't realize how important that is. The illness is such a minor thing comparing to how distant we are from God. So through suffering and thinking that we need God and praying to him, it's actually bringing us closer to God, which by itself to them is actually even more important than the illness going away. So that's just basically kind of like an alarm clock. Like the suffering, the pain is like an alarm clock that reminds you how far away you might be from God. And that's actually ends up being more in your benefit, more than even compared to all the suffering that you had to go through to realize that.
Holy shit.
What?
That's some fucking fucked up logic, man. But yeah.
It is.
I'm trying to do this as the best.
He's trying to, because these are actually, these are the kind of arguments that you actually hear. And so I have a question for you. You said that you were raised several generations non-religiously. Your grandparents were non-religious, and the first time you met religious people, it was a little unnerving because it's the first time you thought, you guys actually believe this stuff. So how did you, in your secular upbringing, having a Jewish background, how did your family treat these Jewish scripture or the religious aspects of Judaism? How did you just assume that everybody thought there were myths, or were you aware that people believed it one time but it's not true? How did you process that? Because I'm actually, the reason I'm curious about this is because I think that in living the secular life, I think, and in the interview you did with Sam Harris, you talked about some precedents about secularizing religions, which I found really interesting, because that's where all the rituals come in, how the rituals become secularized. Like we talked about Christmas or even Halloween or something. They're originally all religious rituals. And I always wonder if there is a precedent in Jewish culture and the Jewish community for other religions like Islam, for instance. Especially since they have so much in common theologically.
Okay, so tell me which, do you want me to
the first one. I'm just kind of, thinking out loud.
Yeah. No, we were raised in such that we were taught that we come from a civilization that had a religion that it strongly believed 5,000 years ago, 3,000, 2,100, but that about 200 years ago there was an enlightenment. In Yiddish, it's called the Haskalah or Haskalah, and the idea was that starting with Baruch Spinoza in Amsterdam, and then but really getting big in the 1800s, and people started to say, wait a minute, these beliefs, these ancient beliefs, they contain a lot of wisdom, but they were made up. They're stories that all people told themselves many, many years ago, trying to explain the world. So they have value in terms of their history. They have value in terms of cultural heritage, and it's great to know these stories, but they're not true literally. They are ancient myths, just like the Greek myths. Children in our schools, they read the Greek myths. They read about Apollo and Zeus, and they think, oh, what great stories. And sometimes they even have lessons and moral tales, but they're not true. And that's how I was taught about the Jewish scriptures, that these were ancient stories that were made up, Noah's Ark and Moses and the Egyptians, and they were great stories for Disney movies, but they weren't literally true. And so we celebrated holidays. My parents spoke a Jewish language, but we were not taught that there was a God watching us. We were not taught that you didn't pray. What was it? There's nothing to pray to. That the world is natural. We don't know why we're here. Existence is ultimately a mystery. And now you get on with your life and you treat people the way you want to be treated, and you pursue your interests, and you love people, and you have relationships. And so, it was much more of and I saw this a lot in Scandinavia, actually, where Lutheranism, the Lutheran Christianity, again, it's part of their cultural heritage. A lot of coming of age rituals that they do, birth, confirmation, marriage, a burial, but no one actually believes the stories are literally true. Even the Jesus stories, they see them more as nice tales, but not true events that actually happen. So I think it is possible to have religious heritage, religious rituals, even a community without the supernatural beliefs. But it's rare, but it's possible.
So, can I say something?
Yeah.
By the way, note to patrons that complain about me interrupting. I'm doing very good today.
You've kind of gone all the way the other direction. I was just jump in.
Okay. So with regards to Scandinavian countries, it's very interesting to me because a lot of atheists and secularists, mostly actually just atheists, they mention Scandinavian countries, but religious people, mostly to counter that, they mostly mention China. What do you like? So they might ask. So a lot of people might ask you, why don't you talk about China? China is not only an atheist country, it's an atheist regime. Not only atheist, anti-religious atheist regime, and they're authoritarian. And here's your example of atheists going, bad. So why do we ignore China as an example?
Well, you just gave the answer right there. It's an authoritarian atheist regime. So in my work as a sociologist, we have to distinguish between what I call organic secularism and coercive or forced secularism. Organic secularism is where you have a free, open, democratic society where there are no consequences for being religious or non-religious. There are no laws against it. You're not going to get tortured, put in prison, kept out of university, kept out of a job. In other words, there are no consequences either way. So people can freely choose to be secular or religious, and there won't be any consequences either way, who they can marry, how they can live. Okay, so that you have to have. Then there are societies that are either coercive atheistic or coercive religious, right? Where there are consequences if you are one or the other. So in the case of communist China, it is an atheist dictatorship. If they only approve 5 state-sanctioned religions. if you are even one of those, you cannot be a member of the Communist Party. If you are not a member of the Communist Party, there are consequences for your family, for your children, what kind of schools they can get into, what kind of apartments they can get, what kind of jobs they can get. So there's a very good reason to not be religious in China, and it's very dangerous to be religious. Look at what's happening to the Muslim community in China. They're in concentration camps right now, having their organs harvested, 1 million people. So I think I say to people, yes, there are horrible, horrible regimes that are atheist by government, right? The former Soviet Union, Albania under Enver Hoxha, China, Vietnam, where you have an official atheist society. Well, what I say to them is, anytime you have an official atheist society, it's just as bad as having an official religious society. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Iran. I mean, if someone wants to talk about religion and they bring up, or atheism and they bring up China, then we can just bring up any atheistic religious dictatorship. Religious dictatorships are bad for human rights, and atheist dictatorships are bad for human rights, which leads us to realize that it's the dictatorship that is the problem, not the atheist or religion. And so that's what I say. I say, look, we have to look at free societies, and when those societies are secular by free choice, they just seem to be doing very well.
No, but is that why you prefer to use the term secularism, since secularism is more of a separation of religion and state and implies more freedom of religion and so on? Or is it?
I mean, I use the terms interchangeably. I think
in a societal way, atheism.
Yeah. I think they're completely I think when we're talking about atheism, we're talking about individual beliefs. We're talking about secularism. We're talking about how to run a country or a society, right? So I think if we want to focus on an individual level, what I try to say to my community at Atheist Republic is that, and you could let me know if you agree with this or not, is that we should claim that atheism doesn't make you immoral, right? And we have examples for that. We have many examples for that. But without God, you could be just as moral. But we shouldn't go the extra step and say
not just as moral, more moral. Moral.
That is what
that's the big mistake. It's not just as moral. In fact, if your morality is based in God belief, you're immoral. Religion destroys morality. It does not set the standard. It destroys it.
I wanted to actually supplement that, Armin.
I just have to. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wrote my book specifically to counter that notion that we can be just as moral as religious people. It's the opposite.
That's actually. And before you go on, I just want to say I want to read this out from Kirkus Reviews, which actually wrote this, where they said that as Zuckerman makes clear, without resorting to smugness, which is you're definitely not smug. I agree with that. Secularity is not nothing, but rather a way of living that enhances moral virtues and promotes human decency. So Phil's position is, and I kind of agree with it, that how we talk about atheism is just, it's not just neutral because Ayn Rand was an atheist and Stalin was an atheist, but the idea that atheism and secularism both are actually more morally sound and morally consistent positions than being religious.
I might disagree with you two here a bit. Okay, but by the way, I don't think we should use them in.
Well, then you are an apostate from the atheist community.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do think that secularism and atheism are completely separate. I mean, they're related, but they're different topics.
Sure.
Yeah, but when it comes to atheism, I do think that atheists are not more moral than religious people. The reason for that is because I don't think what you're saying would be true if religious people were acting moral because they were following their religion. I think that the reason why that's not true is because I think moral religious people are moral in spite of their religion, not because of it.
Fair enough.
And because
that's the same point. The less religious they are, the more moral they are, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So but I'm just saying, like, on average, if you're looking at what I don't want to claim is to go out and saying atheists are superior to religious people morally. All I want to say is that we're not inferior to you. I don't want to claim superiority to them, and I accept your point that people who do follow religion and they're moral because of religion, they're not really being moral. They're just following order. So those people, they are below us. But I think most religious people are not doing that. So they're just like atheists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. They just don't know it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay.
They just don't know it. So one more thing I wanted to talk to you about is that you have a part in your book about the surge of secularism, and where you go through and this is a great collection of stats here that you have. It's called Secularism Surging, and you provide a sort of a country by country tally of how much religion has faded, and it's pretty astounding. You said in the 1960s, it was less than 5% of Americans who said that they had no religion. Today is between 25 and 34%. And among Americans in their 20s, it's 38%. In the UK, 53%, a majority of them, for the first time in recent history, don't identify with any religion.
Ever.
Yeah, and in Canada, in British Columbia, where Armin used to live, 45% don't identify with any religion. New Zealand, it's 40%. So it's. I was looking at all of this, and then of course there's the Scandinavia, right, where you were talking about how many theists there are in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, so on. And I was thinking of this alongside, we had Steven Pinker on the show some time ago. And his book is called Enlightenment Now, and before he had The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he talked about how violence has declined, how just overall we have better moral sensibilities. And he also talks about the Scandinavian countries quite a bit. And it seems like there you go, Enlightenment Now. Do you think there is a correlation between the declining, even though people tend to think of religions as birth identity? So the Pew and Gallup will come out and say in 2050 there will be more Muslims than anybody else. But according to them, they're going to count Armin and myself as Muslims, including our kids, because they're looking at it as a birth identity. They're not looking at how people actually report in terms of what they believe. Yeah. So do you feel that there is a correlation, especially considering what you've written about and researched about the Scandinavian countries?
A correlation between what and what?
Between sort of progress, declining violence, increased security and safety, better economic prospects, more innovation, all of that, all of these sort of positive infant mortality rates and so on, healthcare, all of that, and declining religiosity overall. Absolutely. The best book on that is called The Sacred and Secular by Norris and Engelhardt. They're political scientists. There's no question that we have so much data internationally that as societies become more safe, more secure, more democratic, wealthier, but also egalitarian, so it's not just a few are wealthy and everybody else is poor, as people have a greater sense that life is less precarious, so they have health care, they have housing, they have jobs, they have education, there's a stability in society, religion plummets. And where life is more precarious, where you don't know if you're going to have a job, you don't know if you're going to have a home, you don't know who's going to be in charge of the government tomorrow, you don't know if there's going to be a war tomorrow, you don't know if you're going to have medicine, all these things, religion is very strong. And that is one of the more robust correlations we have. So to me, it's not that secularism causes all these wonderful societal outcomes, but rather all these wonderful societal outcomes tend to increase secularity or atheism or secular study. That said, secularism also does play its part. I do believe that in the history, in the last 150 years, Enlightenment values, rationalism, and even a fair amount of atheism in certain societies have been part of the struggle for better conditions, more democracy, women's rights, gay rights. I don't think they're the main driving engine, but they certainly are part of it. Most of the time, not always. Yeah. And it seems like a lot of this has to do with what you were talking about before, which is comfort and just a sense that there will be justice. If you feel like you're not getting justice, you've been you've been unjustly given a very, very unfair life. While there are people who are terrible people up at the top, and they're going to live and die, and they're never going to pay for it. You want them to pay for it at some point. You want this sort of sense of justice, and it gives you comfort maybe to think that, okay, at some point you're going to get that.
Sure.
So that I feel like that may be one of the main drivers of it. Yeah, Armin, go ahead.
Can I ask a question that is going to take it to a different direction, or do you want me to?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so one major question people ask is whether morality is objective or subjective. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's one of the most common questions that comes about morality when you bring up this topic.
It can only be subjective.
It could only be subjective.
Absolutely.
So does it not depend on what we mean? Because if let me know if you disagree with this. Okay, so if by objective we mean whether if it's written in the fabric, the laws of morality is written in the fabric of the universe, the answer to that is like obviously not. It's not objective in that sense, right? But I think if once we define morality, okay, and once we have a goal defined, the answer on how to achieve that goal most effectively, that's an objective thing.
Sure.
Okay. So
that's Sam Harris's argument in the moral landscape. But realize you gave three premises. Once we define, right away now it's subjective. Once we decide what is the best outcome, so it's ontologically subjective because it resides in the ideas and beliefs of people.
Of course.
But once we lay that, then there are, if we all agree, for example, that life is of value, then we can find objective ways to make life better and longer, for sure.
So that's what people get confused, because when we say there's objectively better answers for us for us to reduce suffering, so therefore there's objectively better ways to be moral. A lot of people may think that we are suggesting that morality from the very big, even before defining it, is objective. No, that's not what we're saying. That part of it is objective. That doesn't mean the whole coming up with wanting for us to be moral. That part is not objective. Right. So,
I totally agree.
Okay, great.
I agree.
Right.
I mean, the way, the trap, see, because what the religious people will say is, if you say that morality is subjective, then it's just whatever you say it is. And that means Hitler is moral. That's the trap that people fear. So they're scared to say, no, it is objective. It is objective. But it depends what you mean by objective. So if you define it, to me, if objective means beyond or irrespective of human will or human thoughts or human opinion, gravity exists whether, if we all died tomorrow, the laws of gravity will still be there. It's an but morality is something that we decide, we consider, we feel, we experience, we argue about. So in that sense, it's bound to human view and human perception and but beyond that, yes, there are, I think, objective ways to then decide what is the best way to reach a certain outcome, for sure.
Right. And the reason why the subjective part doesn't scare me as much as it scares a lot of religious people is that even though it's subjective, the fact is that given the reasons that you give, the evolutionary reasons, most of us want to be compassionate and kind to each other.
Absolutely.
So it is subjective, but it's a subjective that the vast majority of us have a agreement on, that it's a desire that most of us have. And the few minority of us that don't have it, which is basically the psychopath, because the majority of us do desire it, it's even in their best interest, it's even in the psychopath's best interest for us to be ruling the world, for us to coming up with standards. Like, psychopaths wouldn't want psychopaths to be ruling the world, right?
You should make that a T-shirt.
Right. So, okay, I think we have solved the issue of morality.
That's right.
There we go.
That's right.
Yeah, now we know everything. I have. There are some questions we have from our patrons. If you have, I know we have about 3 minutes left. If you can take a couple of questions, or you?
Yeah. Love to.
So, what'll happen is after Phil goes, then Armin and I will sort of continue this discussion as well. But the first question comes from Rocket Sauce.
Yes, I love rocket sauce.
And they're saying, what does a secular society need to learn to take from religious cultural practices so as to avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater? And the example that they're giving is like the community, the sense of community in church. That we get. And
so, so basically Robert Putnam in his work on social capital, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And social capital is the idea that people embedded in social networks can draw from those social networks when they are in need. So if you're high in social capital, there are people that can help you when you're sick, people that can help you when your children are sick, people that can support you when you lose your job, and you have people that can act as cushions when life is tough. And if you're low in social capital, you're isolated, you're alienated, you're cut off, you're more likely to be depressed, and you don't have those groups. And so what we know from an American context, and probably Canadian as well, I would assume, that people who are embedded in religious communities have greater social capital, and communities that are high in social capital seem to do well. They do better than highly individualistic societies where people are not socially networked as much and embedded as much. So I would say the two best things from religion are that social capital, where people take care of each other when they're in need, and the second thing is ritual. I think we need moments of significance that are set apart to recognize certain changes in life, be it coming of age, be it debt passages in life, be it marriage, be it menstruation, whatever. Those things are good and wonderful, and they seem to be universal. So all societies have some form of ritual, life cycle ritual, and all societies seem to thrive, all groups and people seem to thrive when they're socially embedded, and they seem to be worse when they're isolated. In fact, Durkheim's great study on suicide showed that the more isolation in society, the higher the suicide rates, the more social embeddedness and integration, the lower the suicide rates. So I would argue that yes, secular societies would suffer without those things. So the question is, how do we ensure those things? And what I would say is, my first reaction is, look, there's two options. One, we secularize religion. So we keep religion. We just get rid of the silly nonsense. We get rid of the fairy tales, the threats of hell, the God is king, like Jewish communities or Scandinavian Lutheran communities, where we kind of keep what we like, but we get rid of the rest. On the other hand,
that's kind of like what we were talking about in terms of just keeping the rituals,
exactly,
because that's really what you keep.
Exactly, right? And it's the same reason Americans love the 4th of July. They don't really know the Constitution, and they don't even know the history of the Revolutionary War, but they love the 4th of July. They love Thanksgiving, even they don't. There's many things we do and there's many significant secular rituals: graduation from high school, prom night. Married, weddings, there's a lot of things that you can do that are secular without religion that are still ritualistic. But on the other side, I would say the notion that religion provides certain things like community and what will we do when it's gone is a very limited view of humanity. Look, I was in Vietnam last May. Vietnam is not a Christian society. The whole idea of like a church that you go to on Sunday and that you play softball for the church, that doesn't exist in Vietnam. This is a long, deep, rich culture with a huge, long history and heritage that doesn't rely on congregations to give people a sense of meaning. So the whole notion of a kind of like we need the community that religion provides is a very American kind of 1950s view that is not universalistic, right? Much of Africa, much of South America did not rely on religion to give people a sense of community, social bonding, and social capital. So my sense is humans have figured this out before. If a certain kind of religion fades right now, they will figure it out in other ways. And change is the only constant.
So the only danger with secularizing religious rituals is that non-secularized religious institutions might want to use, if religion is dying, but we're still keeping the label and we're still keeping the branding, a lot of people use that as counting on their side and try to keep spreading the idea that they're relevant, and they use that as a way to market religion and keep religion around. However, I'm not against that I mean, I put up a Christmas tree. I like going to churches. I like going and looking at mosques, and I find a lot of their art and all of that beautiful. So I'm not against that. I just think that the people that want to remain culturally Christian or culturally Jewish, and much less so, but culturally Muslim, I do think that these people really need to signal that the fact that this is only cultural. Like they have to.
I agree.
They have more responsibility to spread the fact that they're non-believers more than other people to avoid the.
I agree.
Yeah,
that's why I wrote a book about it, Armin.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
Good. And so did Phil with living a lot of So another question comes from Anne Marin. She's saying, Phil, even without belief, did you ever struggle to find morality in Torah stories? If so, how did you process that? I'm ex-Jewish and often struggled with that. Eventually, I gave up. So.
Wow, I've never heard someone say ex-Jewish. That's pretty sad. That's a real a real damaged person. I mean,
that's beautiful. No, that's beautiful. I love that, ex-Jewish. I think more people should be able to say that.
Yeah, but Jewish is not just a set of beliefs. It's a heritage, and it's actually genetic. I gave my spit to 23andMe, and it came back 99.9% Ashkenazi Jew. There's no marker for Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu. Only a marker for Jewish.
It is for Hindu. No. Hindus have so-called Hindu atheists have the same disagreements with each other than in the Jewish. So atheists in the Jewish community, I know a lot of people that say I'm an atheist Jew, and I know a lot of people say like, no, I'm not an atheist Jew. I'm an ex-Jew. Atheists, right? And there's a debate between the Jewish community on that. The Hindu atheists have the same dilemma. A lot of them are saying I'm a Hindu atheist. Some people are like, I'm ex-Hindu atheist.
Let me put it this way: Can you be an ex-Persian?
No, but that's the issue.
I mean, it doesn't. You can't. It's like if you see Jew. Yeah, no, I know it's a debate, and people can identify however they want. It's none of my business. I'm just saying that. I don't hear that a lot. Like I hear people say I'm a secular Jew, or I'm not really Jewish, or my mom wasn't Jewish, or I don't believe anymore. But to call yourself ex-Jewish is, in a sense, to me,
it is increasing, and the reason why it's increasing is because people say like, well, I'm not ex-Jewish when it comes to the definition of a Jew as a ethnicity. I am ex-Jewish when it comes to the definition of a Jew as somebody who believes in the Jewish religion. Right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Right.
There is actually, we had David Silverman on the show.
Oh, yeah.
And David Silverman famously did that talk where he told a bunch of secular Jews that he's like, you are not Jews, you're atheists. Because his position was, and it was actually really interesting because we had a whole conversation about this, and I am still kind of there are places where he makes a lot of sense because he argues his things very well, but there are other places where
he says there's no such thing as a Jewish race. There's only Ashkenazi Jews is a real thing, but other than Ashkenazi Jews, Judaism is not a race.
Right. So he was basically saying that the ethnicities were Ashkenazic, Sephardic, and so on, because the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic, they don't really share. Their 23andMe profiles are going to be as different as anybody else. So there's anyway, that's another.
No, I guess what I would say is, look, people can identify however they want. It's none of my business, and whether Jews are a religion, a race, an ethnicity, a culture, this is a long debate. If you define Judaism as just a religious set of religious beliefs, then for sure there's nothing genetic about it, and you can be ex-Jewish if you held those beliefs and you no longer hold those beliefs. If you see Jews as a people with a common history, then you can. You can't. It's like saying then you can't really be ex-Jewish. It's part of your background. But again, I really don't care.
But
I would say
What
I would say to the woman is, when I heard those Torah stories, they seemed really immoral. The one that was the most immoral to me was the Passover story where God killed the firstborn Egyptian sons of the Egyptian people. And I remember thinking that what a genocidal maniac. When I heard about Abraham being willing to kill his own son Isaac because God told him to, when I heard about turning the woman into a pillar of salt. Most of the stories struck me as really immoral and disgusting. I like Ecclesiastes. I think there's some great stuff in there.
Right.
I think the story of Job is pretty powerful because in the end, God comes off like an asshole, and you see that God really has no defense. But yeah, I think the God of the Old Testament is horrible, but there's some good stuff in there too.
But this is the problem with Judaism when it comes to
there's lots of problems with Judaism.
No, but compared to other religion, because this vagueness behind. Okay, so when it comes to Judaism, it could mean a religion, it could mean a culture and history, it could mean an ethnicity, and more recently, apparently, it could also mean a nationality. That's the fourth definition that are coming up.
Right.
And
That's
I think that this is really strategic, because now if you go after the religion, people could accuse you of being anti-Semitic because of the confusion between what you're talking about, right? And I think, Islam, I tell people, like, when we go after Islam, a lot of people accuse us of being bigots. I tell people, imagine how much more easier it would be for them to accuse us of being bigots if the word for Muslim and Arab were the same word, right?
Right.
But because Judaism has that strategic benefit, it's really hard for us to go after Judaism without being accused of being anti-Semites.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think a strategic benefit's hard for me since I lost so many family in the Holocaust.
No, strategic benefit for the religion against us, for the religion. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think all religions. I always try it, like with my students who fear Islamophobia, I always say, like, you have to make a distinction between a set of scriptural doctrines and then actual people, right? Are you critiquing beliefs, ideologies, scriptural doctrines, texts, or are you critiquing actual people that live down the street from you and go shopping and send their kids to children? These are two different things.
Exactly.
And so when I say I'm critical of Islam, I don't mean Muslim people. I might critique an individual Muslim person because I don't like what they're doing as a person, but when I say I'm critical of Islam or Judaism or Christianity, I mean the doctrines as they are enforced and pushed upon people, either or the beliefs in the scriptures, the Quran, the Hadith, the Sunnah. I mean, that's what I mean. And so I agree with you with Judaism. It's like, if you want to critique the Jewish religion and then you're automatically called anti-Semitic, that's fucked up, because you're not against Jewish people. You might just be critical of certain religious practices, which
just like most Jewish people are, just like most ethnically Jewish people are. And
that's right.
And I think a lot of people think that I pushed it too far when I compared that to like white supremacy, because let me know if you disagree with me, but Judaism, the religion of Judaism, is a race supremacist ideology. It teaches you race supremacy, right?
All ancient people saw themselves as the chosen people.
No, but Islam. So Islam is a tribalistic religion. Yeah. It is tribal, like Muslims are superior to non-Muslims, but it's not based on race. Judaism is a race supremacist religion. So I tell people, if you're against white supremacy, you should also be against Judaism, because Judaism is a race supremacist religion. And people are like, wow, Armin is comparing the victims, Jews are the main victims of Nazism, which is a white supremacist religion. I'm like, oh, Armin is comparing the victims of Nazism to Nazism.
This
I'm like, no, I wasn't talking about people. I was talking about the ideology. It is a race supremacist.
These are things, as you said, it's unfortunately, even though it seems very like it's common sense to us, it's very important to say outright that we're talking about the actual theology and we're not talking about the people. So I'm gonna let you go. There's one quick question if you want, or
last question.
You're good with like a quick. So this one, Dr. Zuckerman, the last one. From Mars. Dr. Zuckerman, what's your perspective on the dangers of preserving religious rituals at the risk of carrying over fundamentalist material? I agree we do need rituals and structure, but the leftovers. He's asking, but the leftovers can come back to bite us later on in the rear.
Yeah, that's true. You never know. It's always hard to know. There's always unintended consequences. There's always those things that come back and bite you in the rear. And it may not even work. I remember when they started to do all these atheist communities like Sunday Assembly, someone, and all these kind of like humanist congregations where you would just have community and ritual and singing, but no God. And I remember somebody said it's like non-alcoholic beer. Like, what's the point? So it may not work. It may not work to secularize these religions. I think it has to happen, again, organically. You can't force it. It's either going to happen or it's not. I don't think Jews, chose to stop believing. It just happened. I don't think Scandinavians chose. It just kind of happens, and we could try to figure out why, what economic and political and cultural and historical factors. But I think if we can try to maintain certain rituals, I think it can be done successfully. But yeah, the caller's right. You never know, and maybe we ought to get rid of the baby and the bathwater.
All right.
Yeah.
Phil, yeah. Sorry,
we're going to continue. I want to continue talking about this after you leave because I have my own take on this. But
yeah, sure.
Anyway,
good. and we're gonna. But thank you. This was like amazing. Yeah. It was really so insightful. And I have the book is What It Means to Be Moral. Why religion is necessary is not necessary. Really not necessary for living an ethical life. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it, and I've got so many things here, like dog-eared, to ask you maybe at some other time. But
next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks, Armin. Thanks, Ali.
No, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
This was great. Sorry for going over time. It was too good.
No, keep up the good work. Thanks so much for everything. All right, take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
All right.
So.
All right. You might. Okay, I'll just hang up myself.
Do that.
How do I remove from call?
There you go.
All right, hold on.
Okay,
I need to fix the windows. You can keep talking while I fix the windows. Okay?
Yeah, so I'll keep on talking. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. His book is really, really good. I am going to what it means to me. I'm going to read out the.
That last question. But anyway, let's keep answering Patreon questions until we're done with the Patreon questions. But the last point.
I'm just going to read my the blurb that I wrote that appears on the book. I'll just read it out for the audience so that they know what I wrote about it. Was I said that in this brilliant, provocative, and timely book, Phil Zuckerman breaks down the myth that our morality comes from religion, compellingly making the case that when it comes to the biggest challenges we face today, a secular approach is the only truly moral one. So I think he makes a very compelling case that it's not secularism, atheism aren't just neutral. They're not just like, well, this is another set of belief, whatever it is. They're actually morally more sound and more consistent positions to have.
All right.
So
anyway, can I respond to that last thing? Okay.
Yeah.
Whether we should be afraid. Okay. So I want to make it. I think this is the first time I'm going to do it. I want to separate the idea of secularizing the rituals of religion from the whole idea of reform. Ali, I need you to pay attention to this. So let me know when you stop typing.
I'm listening to you, man.
Okay.
I'm just responding to Morris.
Because this is very important. Okay, this is a key thing that I'm I'm discussing for the first time here because I've been very much anti-reform. But the idea of secularizing rituals, I'm not against. And these are separate things, okay? The idea of reform is trying to keep the religion and the belief in the religion as something valuable, okay? That is different from secularizing rituals. Secularizing rituals and keeping them as something cultural comes with the admission that none of these ideas are based in reality. Okay?
Right.
So that is not reform. I support that. In fact, I like religious rituals if it comes with the understanding. It's basically like enjoying Marvel fictions or Harry Potter or dressing up in Star Wars costumes. It's pretty much that. You understand that this is fiction. You understand that these are myths. You still enjoy the rituals. That is not reform. That is secularizing the rituals and keeping it. That is completely okay. Okay.
Yeah, and it's actually very satisfying too. So there was who was it? I think it was the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, who tweeted out this whole thing that this is not this. He put out a picture of a Christmas tree and he said that this is not a holiday tree. This is a Christmas tree. And I responded to it because over here, so many Muslims and so many atheists, they all have Christmas trees. And there was this one Christmas tree with a crescent on top of it instead of a star.
Right.
Because it was a Muslim household.
Oh, that's funny. Okay.
And I just posted it. And I was like, hey, Christmas Mubarak. It's not just yours anymore. No. Christmas has as little to do with Christ as Thursday has to do with Thor. And and I enjoy that. I like that because it actually pisses him off.
Right.
That's one thing I like, because you take it and you make it something of your. It becomes like a universal thing. And a lot of the rituals we have now, like Halloween, or Halloween was also an old pagan religious ritual, right? That eventually became secularized.
Right, but the reason why I think it's important to focus on removing the belief is because that's the fangs of religion. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. So if you secularize the rituals and keep it without the belief. Without the belief is the key phrase here, okay? Just take that part. Without the belief. Because if you say without the belief, you have defanged the whole thing, okay? The danger of reform is that it lets you keep the belief without some of this shocking the shock value of like ISIS or all the beheadings and all that like gory stuff, like, oh my God. But that's dangerous because it keeps the belief and lets the belief survive for longer, and all those shock value might come back because all those shocking things might come back, or it might not come back. The main cost of cost of belief is not actually those shocking ISIS suicide bombing stuff. The main cost of religion are more subtle ways that you get fucked by religion on a daily basis in ways that doesn't make it to the headline news, right? So the belief, if the belief stays there, the cost of religion is going to be with you. Like I tell people always, like, if you enjoying Harry Potter when you understand that this is fiction, doesn't cause society any harm. But if people all of a sudden believe that Harry Potter is based on the real world, that's a society that is going to be very dangerous to live in. And I could come up with many consequences from that might not even cause people doing suicide bombing or worse. But if you live in a society where people believe that Harry Potter is real, there are going to be a lot of problems in the society in many, many different subtle ways. So removing the belief is the key element. And if you keep rituals and you don't have the belief, that is not reform. And the danger with reform is actually even more dangerous than the fundamentalists, I think, in this day and age, because it's the main defense mechanism for keeping these beliefs relevant.
Keeping the religion alive.
Keeping the beliefs relevant, okay? So again, it's very easy to mix these two with each other, reforming religion and secularizing the rituals, because for a lot of people it seems like they're the same like as each other, because they are both sold as keeping something from religion but removing the harmful bits. That's why people confuse them with each other. But what I'm telling you is that secularizing the rituals is actually removing the harmful bits, which is the belief. But the idea of reform is actually keeping the most problematic part of religion with it, which is the faith, which is the belief in things without evidence. All right? So that was my thing. Anyway, should we go to if you wanted to add something to this, go on, or else we could go to the other Patreon question?
Yeah, no, I think that I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of what Phil actually said in his interview with Sam Harris. This is a long time ago. Mm-hmm. This is before Sam Harris did the podcast and just did sort of interviews and put them up on his site. When he talks about secularizing religion, he talked about how certain religious groups achieved this, like Reformed Judaism, where they took rituals and holidays. They took charity, the sense of community and belonging, and they kept a lot of that. They kept what they liked from Judaism, but they outgrew the super. So it was very characteristically, the idea was that they didn't believe. They got rid of the faith and kept the fun. Keep the fun, right. Get rid of the faith. And that's how I look at it. Keep the fun in the food and get rid of the faith.
Especially the food, yes.
Yeah, so there was this, and then of course there are some rituals. I mean, even with the rituals, you got to be selective. You don't want to keep FGM or male circumcision, or you don't want to keep any of those things. You want to keep the stuff that is, again, the fun without the faith. So he also gave the example of Nordic Lutherans, and he said, quote, they observe traditional religious holidays and congregate now and then, even in church, and they even feel Christian. But they do all of these ostensibly religious things without a scintilla of actual faith in the supernatural. And I just want, when I quoted him in my book, I was saying, I just wanted people to imagine, right, and this is in the chapter called A Tale of Two Identities, imagine that if you're, as a Muslim, right, as part of the Muslim community, you are, your family stays, your community, you're still part of your family, you're still part of your community. You're an open atheist, you don't believe in anything, but you can still come to the Ramadan iftar parties. You still have them, but they're bring your own booze or iftar parties, right?
Right.
You can have like all kinds of games, you can have
you can
intermingling
only say
of the
that
sexes.
with the Sunnis, by the way. With the Shias, there's nothing fun to keep, Ali. I'm telling you. Okay, this is why I was so confused.
Yeah, for the Ramadan and the
No,
it is fun to keep. I actually disagree with that.
With you. Okay, so I think maybe I'm biased. Okay, because this is why I was confused.
Let me just complete the thought. Like here, the whole idea is that this is really hard to imagine that you show up and you have your own sort of iftar party, but this is kind of like having like people celebrate Christmas without even thinking of Christ, and we've got elves and Santa Claus and all this stuff. So imagine if you could do Eid or think of Ramadan that way. That's all I'm saying. But yeah, what are you saying about Shias? Go ahead.
I'm just thinking. This is why when I read your book, I was confused by that part, because I understood cultural Christians. Because there's so many cultural stuff about Christianity that people want to keep because they're just fun. The music, the food, the celebrations. I understood cultural Judaism because there's so many fun, rituals and all the, I don't know. I understood. So I understand some Jews hate that and they don't want to have, they want to leave the ideology. Plus, they hate the culture as well. But some people want to keep it. I did not understand that with Islam, because with my experience, people that leave Islam, they're like, I couldn't think of it.
Fewer things.
No, there was nothing. But I'm telling you why there's a difference between you and me, okay? But every single person that I met that left Islam, they're like, I don't want anything to do with this shit ever again, right? But I understand that now, as somebody that has left Islam for a long time, now I'm coming back to checking out the history of Islam and all that. I'm finding some interest in it, and I find some parts of it very, very, I'm very curious about it. So I understand that part, but I couldn't.
A lot of that is because Islam hasn't been secularized as much as
Christianity. Let me finish this thought.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand it when it comes to the culture and the music and the rituals, because there was nothing fun there. And the reason why you found some fun in there and I didn't is because you grew up in a mixed Sunni Shia society. I grew up in Iran, which was only Shia. And I tell you, Ali, there is everything, especially in Iran, in a country where you have the more Zoroastrian, more ancient Persian celebrations, and you compare it with all the Shia rituals.
Like Nowruz
Yes.
and everything. Yeah.
Everything that seems Persian, I'm not the nationalist, but this is just how it comes off us, right? Everything that it came off as Persian or Zoroastrian or ancient, Persian empire seemed like a celebration of life, seemed like colorful, seemed like getting gifts, and and everything that had to do with Shiism was black, was about crying, was about death, was about beating yourself. It was about blood, right? So growing up, we just saw that religion is, religious rituals. It was about, it looked evil. It looks like cultish, blood cultish. It looks like evil. It looks about crying and being upset all the time. And
that's how it is right now. Okay?
Right.
So here's I'll tell you. So here's a contrast.
But I'm just saying.
But
comparing that to Sunnis, it's less like that. Sunnis do have more. We don't even call it Eid when it comes to Shia celebration. Sunnis must I mean, I understand that Shias outside of Iran are different, right? But in Iran, when we say Eid, we're not talking about anything Shia. Eid is only about Nowruz, which is the ancient Persian pre-Islamic celebration at the beginning of the new year. Okay,
so let me tell you,
I was confused when I left Iran and people were talking about, we were saying, oh, Eid Mubarak, and they were saying talking about something as Islamic. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Eid is like the spring. So this is why I couldn't even understand how you see anything fun in religion, because in Iran it's a bit different. We'll go on.
So the example that you're giving of the Shia versus the Zoroastrian thing, I have a similar kind of thing within my own household. Okay, so I come from a Ithnashri Shia background, which is all about death and crying and mourning and everything, and Muharram and self-flagellation. Whereas Lishba, my wife, comes from an Ismaili Shia background, the Sixer background, and for them, every time we're mourning something, mourning is kind of banned in their religion. So every month they have a dance thing at their mosque.
Right.
Okay. That where all the guys, girls mix together, they dance, and they all stay. Even the secular and the atheist Ismailis, they show up there and they still go to these things so they can see all their friends. They celebrate Navroz. They have a lot of the sort of the Persian, the same kind of the holidays and everything like that they celebrate. So there's that aspect, and they have that celebration thing. And she always asks me, she's like, why wouldn't you just come with me and celebrate all of this stuff instead of like keeping the cultural elements of Shiism? And for me, it was very different. I think it is probably different because we were outside of Iran. And even though we did wear black and we went to these majalis, no, we didn't really listen to it or care for it. We just went there because we just met our friends. We had tea and samosas afterwards. Like, you'd cry for about 15 minutes. Everybody would cry, and then they'd come out, and then everybody'd have tea and samosas. We'd talk about things. We'd get to stay up late at night. And the other thing for me that was very important as a musician is that I learned, you know how Christians learn music from gospel choirs and stuff like that? A lot of really big singers like Beyonce, they started singing in church. So for me, a lot of that started with the nohas and the marshi and the salams and everything.
Yeah, together. Different experience though.
So yeah, it was a different experience than you. Number one. Number two, there are actually really horrible things that can also be secularized into fun things, and the most bizarre one is Easter, right? The crucifixion of Jesus, and yes, it's the resurrection and all that.
But in Iran, there's no desire for that, right? Because in Iran, for example, where I come from, people are like, we don't need to secularize this shit. We already have our own superior non-religious celebration.
Well, listen, I'm pretty sure that way back in time, at some point, when this whole somber reflection on the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection and all the lessons of that were replaced by bunnies and multicolored eggs and kids going on Easter hunts. Yeah. No, so what I'm saying is, it's completely unrecognizable. There's no symbol of Jesus on a cross or any of that crap with the Easter bunnies and the eggs. But that is what secularizing religion is.
I know. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm just saying right now there's no desire for it, at least where I come from. But can we get to... We need to finish the Patreon questions because I need to go soon as well.
Yeah, let's do that because it's midnight where I am too, so I should probably go too. So
there were some good questions I saw. Ask one from Rocket Sauce and also one from Matt. I saw a couple from Matt.
Yeah, I saw the one from.
And also
so
Alex.
Matt is asking. He's saying, "What's morality without survivalism, as in living or modern civilization where there's no war?" What's morality without survivalism? I don't completely get that.
Yeah, I don't get it either.
And he's saying then he also says how morality in Islam came to be, as Islam is indeed the worst religion in this age.
Well, the first one is like a whole episode of itself, but I'll tell you the second one is an easy answer. It is, yes, the answer is yes, but not among all religions. And I don't know if this is true. Okay, so if Islam is the worst living religion, but I would argue, and somebody that understands like Norse mythology that better than I do, but I would argue that if Vikings were still around and they had their religion, that was worse than Islam. And the reason why I say that is because in Islam, you go. I don't know. By the way, this is just a fun thing to talk about, but I don't know if it's true. I'm just like randomly thinking about stuff. But in Islam, you go to the best part of heaven if you die as a martyr. But that's not but you can still go to heaven even if you're not a martyr, right? In Islam. My understanding is that Vikings believe that the only way to go to Valhalla is if you die in a war. You have to have your sword or your axe or whatever in your hand to die to be able to go to Valhalla. Imagine how dangerous would that be if that ideology was still around. Like, that's much more pro-war than Islam is. So I mean, again, it's fun to enjoy mythology, but imagine if that ideology became a world religion that was still alive today, you would have a lot more excuses for going to war and more people motivated to die in war. If the only way to go to Valhalla was to die with a sword in your hand, holy shit, that's pretty. I mean, Islam doesn't say that the only way to go to heaven is for you to be a martyr. It's just one of the best ways, but not the only way. So I think that would have been more dangerous if it was still around. I don't know. What do you think, Ellie?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I was looking at this other question from Matt, and I was trying to figure it out. He's saying, did philosophy form morality? I feel like, I don't know, I think philosophy is a very, very broad term. It's just
I mean, if philosophy is just thinking about stuff and coming up with answers, then I give you two categories of when people answer where morality comes from. The first answer is when it comes to the natural desires that you have for cooperation and sympathy. The second answer is that the social standards that we come up with to satisfy those desires. So, it would be true. If philosophy is just natural coming up with answers to these things, so when it comes to the natural desires that we have, no, philosophy had nothing to do with that. That's just more a genetic thing. But when it comes to second part, by definition of philosophy, yes, of course it's philosophy, because when it comes to coming up with standards and values, just the whole process of thinking about that would be a philosophical question. It would be a philosophical question that requires a scientific answer, okay? Because I think philosophy is good for coming up with questions, but not necessarily good at coming up with answers, right?
Thank you. I got so much crap for just writing that. I just said that.
Really?
Because all of the things about the only way to come to objective answers about anything is science. That's the only way. There's no other way. Everything else can claim to do it. And then people talk about mathematics, and mathematics is kind of like the language of science. It's also philosophical realm, so there's some overlap there. This idea that philosophy is good to generate questions. And the most useful parts of philosophy, right, are even the question generation, have already been incorporated into science and the scientific method, like hypothesis generation, null hypothesis generation,
yes.
right, falsify. But all of these things have already been incorporated into it. But eventually, if you want to get to an objective answer, then only science is going to bring you that. When you want to analyze it and discuss it, and find out the best way to apply it in an ethical, moral way, then yes, those are philosophical things. And that's where, when Phil was saying that it is subjective, I agree with that.
And again, that's true even when it comes to morality, because people might think like, oh yeah, that's true with scientific stuff, but morality is not a scientific question. No, it completely is. Philosophy could give you moral questions, moral like dilemmas and stuff. But again, even when it comes to the best answers, even when it comes to the topic of morality, science is not only the best way that we have to answer.
It's the best way to inform that.
No, I would go as far as saying I will go more extreme than saying it's the best way to answer these questions. I would say it's the only way to answer these questions. All right.
Yeah, it's the only way to objectively answer these questions. But when you don't have an answer, but you need one, like for instance, in systems of justice, what kind of evidence is good enough? Is circumstantial evidence enough to convict? Things like that. I mean, those are kinds of things where you have to extrapolate. You can't come to a definitive answer.
Yeah, those are not really answers. Those are just
guesses. Will
have
to be.
Those are guesses.
Okay. So
right.
Yeah, it's a semantic thing. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's it. Is there anything that
did we miss anything?
Rocket Sauce is saying Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
What? The Rocket Sauce is saying, did Vikings have threat of hell? But I think that's part of another conversation that these guys are having.
I don't know. You guys correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Let us know in the comment section.
Yeah. So anyway, that was really interesting. I want to actually get into this more, and I think we should talk about this more in terms of just what.
By the way, tweet at Ali your guest suggestions. Go to Ali Rizvi's Twitter account, follow him, and tell him because I'm in charge of fixing all the technical stuff when it comes to our podcast. Ali is in charge of finding, inviting, and bringing on guests. So
all of the guests, yeah.
So go, and when you go to Ali Rizvi's Twitter account and recommend guests to him, tag the guests that you're recommending so that the guest becomes aware of our podcast as well. Okay, so please do that. Go, So anyway,
so I had this. And before we close, I wanted to bring up this new book that has come out on Scripture by Karen Armstrong, who is Armin's favorite writer of all time, I think, right?
No,
Am I right?
Well, yes, on some subjects, and definitely no when it comes to her religion apologism.
Right. So she talks about, what are sacred texts. We know what Scripture. And Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist, wrote a review of it, and he wrote a really glowing review of it about how, texts should be interpreted and so on. And I really like Nicholas Kristof, so I wrote a whole tweet thread in response to it. And he quoted it.
Oh.
He actually, so he went and he said that this is a critical thread in response to my article, and that's what I wrote, which I thought was actually quite generous of him. He actually wrote, he's like a critical take in the form of a thread on my review of Karen Armstrong's new book on Scripture, and he quoted it. So if you guys want to, you should go check that out.
That is so great. Like, I wish more people were like that. Like, this guy is like, oh, here's a perfect criticism of my view. Yeah. Like, if people, this is how you handle criticism. I accept it. Yeah. I hope I'm like that. I don't know if I'm like that. I wish like somebody could bring some strong criticism against my view, and I could be like, oh, this is great. This is a great pushback against my views. I hope all of us could be mature. I have.
When you bring up devil's advocate arguments, a lot of times you're acknowledging that those are arguments that should be listened to, right? Mm-hmm. So you're in a way showing respect to those arguments, even if you don't think the arguments mean much. Yeah. But in any case, so he kind of did that, and I actually I would love to get Karen Armstrong on this. I am going to reach out to her. I'm very, very pessimistic. I don't think she's going to come on. No. So, I don't think it's going to happen. But nevertheless, I think we should sit and we should talk about this idea about the interpretation of Scripture, because this is such a common trope that I hear from all the time with Nick Kristof and Karen Armstrong talking about how Scriptures need to be analyzed. I'm not going to go into what I wrote in the tweet thread. It was actually it was a very good response, which is why I think he quoted it.
Link to it in the description of the public version of this podcast.
Sure, I will, but I think we should have a separate episode on this, and I'll read out the whole response then. Exactly. And we should probably have a live stream on this, even if we can't get Karen Armstrong on the podcast.
Yes,
so I think that would be a good thing, because that's kind of related to this.
What is the book again by Karen Armstrong? What's the name? So people, if you want to go check it out.
Oh man, now I have to plug it. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Let's see. Yeah, it's called The Lost Art of Scripture.
So, and it defends Scripture and like basically against people like us that is calling it like the whole
misunderstanding. So what she's saying is that the fundamentalists use it to justify all of their misogyny,
but there's
and then
a lot of good in there.
Use it. Yeah. And then the secular liberals use it to justify their bigot.
Oof.
So
wait, say that again, to justify what? Because you got cut for a second.
Her basic
that's the last sentence. To atheists use it to justify their bigotry?
The secular liberals use the same passages to justify their bigotry against religion, to expose it as a pack of lies.
Bring her on. Let's do this.
She's not going to come on. It's not going to happen, but still.
We can try.
I still think we should discuss it. I'm actually going to read through the book. I'm actually going to get the book because I do respect her for putting this out there. So right. I'm going to
do Mars's last question.
Okay, Mars.
Let's do that and then go. Mars.
All right. So Mars has said, have you guys thought about maybe having Yasmin Mohammed back on? She just released her new book. Yes. And I reached out to her, and I'm going to follow up, and I'll see if she has the time and if she's able to come on.
Yes.
And I think that would be awesome. The last I heard from her, she was up for coming on. So I think that'll happen. She was a former host on this podcast, and she just finished. So, by the way, Yaz actually just did an episode with Sam Harris. A lot of you have heard her story, are going to hear her tell the story, but I think she did it in a very, very powerful way. So,
by the way, thank you to Yaz for I don't know if you guys knew, but we just recently lost our Twitter account, Secular Jihadists, and we did like a whole Twitter storm at Twitter support and tried to get our account back, and we finally managed. We did get our account back, thanks to all the people that retweeted that and supported us in trying to get our Twitter account back. It got suspended, for whatever reason. And also thank you to Yas for retweeting that. So that was her. She supported us in getting our account back. And also thank you to Richard Dawkins and everyone else that supported us in to Yeah, thank you.
Oh, Richard Dawkins did too?
Yes.
I missed that.
Yeah, he did.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes.
So, yeah, anyway, we're going to, let's see. Richard Dawkins also has a new book out. I've tried to reach out to him. He's a lot harder to get on, but let's see. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. In any case, this was a lot of fun. I think this is a really good topic. I'd love to do more stuff like this, and it would be really good to have Yaz on. It would be really good to have that live stream about the Karen Armstrong book. There's also an ex-Muslim group in South Africa, ex-Muslims of South Africa.
Oh, let's bring him on.
And we've been talking about having them on. A lot of times, guys, sometimes guests get delayed because there are time differences. There's some of them where we can only do it, say, on a Saturday or Sunday, since Armin and I and the guests are all in 3 different time zones. Yeah. So for those, the scheduling actually gets pushed out a little bit more. So at some point it will happen.
Also, can you look into any major atheist groups in Nigeria? I really want us to be more informed about what's happening in Nigeria right now.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And if you could, since you're now in the area, Indonesia and Malaysia, reach out, see if you can find some people over there. I think they have the same time difference, so it'll actually work out really well if we do that.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So anyway, tweet at us with guest suggestions, and thank you for listening again. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Mars. Thank you, James. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Darko.
Thank you for being patrons.
Matt Rose, Rocket Sauce, all you guys, everyone who joined in. Thank you very much.
But guys, seriously, thank you for being patrons. We really like all the energy and time and resources that we spend on making this show happen. Like we don't thank you enough for supporting the show. So thank you.
James Lauerman's here too, and so is Lois. And everybody.
And if you're not a patron, please, link is in the description. Please support us in any way you can. There's a PayPal link as well, by the way.
All right, great.
All right, love you guys.
Okay, everybody. See you. Thank you. See you next time.
The secular jihadists have been made possible thanks to the Illuminati and the covert support of Israel and the CIA. That's what we have been told, but we haven't received our checks yet. If you like what we do, please support us. Share the podcast with your friends. Write and tweet us with topic and guest suggestions. Or head over to secularjihadists.com and give $1 or more for exclusive access to live video. Have your questions read and answered on the air, and more. Till next time, may the flying spaghetti monster be with you.